Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. The immensely popular television show, Vikings, which is now coming to an end in 2020, has been rather double-edged, as far as I'm concerned. In that, while it has generated a renewed interest in the Viking Age, which is good, it is acted by a superb cast and has actually dispelled an old stereotype associated with the Vikings. It has also presented a not always very accurate portrayal of that era in other ways, which I've spoken about previously a year ago. But since the show is ending, I just thought I'd take another look at it. Some new comments as well as some old ones. Well, Vikings. It's only a television show, you might say. It's just entertainment. It's not a university lecture on Norse history, so it doesn't have to be right in every detail. Complaining about it is just pointless nitpicking. Well, true enough, it is just a TV show, an entertainment medium not exactly famous for its strict adherence to historical accuracy, nor is Hollywood for that matter. So, what's the harm if it deviates from genuine history here and there, or indeed if it pays scant regard to historical fact at all? I'd like to say a few words on that topic before I get into the show itself. Television and movies are primarily entertainment, so they might be seen by many as little more than that, and so it hardly matters how true to life anything is. But there is also an educational aspect when it comes to history. And while storylines, well, they can be as fantastic and improbable as you like, I do feel that basic historical fact concerning the way of life, clothing, manners and customs and so on should be considered. It's nice when historical dramas are done with careful attention to detail, when they try to get it as right as possible. If, for example, you're making costumes, it's just as easy to make them correct as it is to get them wrong. And so many people see movies as being factual in details like that. They see them as true representations of historical events, characters, and so forth. The danger of movie inaccuracy is so often that it is seen as fact. As I've just said, that is the main problem. I know those who think that the awful Thor movies are actually a true representation of Old Norse beliefs. Oh yes. Or that the United States Navy really did capture a German submarine with the Enigma machine, when in fact it was the British Royal Navy that did it, and America wasn't even in the war at the time. Very recent history and totally distorted. People see a movie, though, like that, and they think it's fact. Perhaps the best example of movie inaccuracy as it affects popular ideas has to be the United States cavalry, where every popular idea is completely wrong, thanks to Hollywood. The same errors have been repeated in movie after movie after movie until everyone sees those errors as correct historical fact, even those who should know better, and surprisingly enough, that even includes the United States Army themselves in some of their own recreation events where they get it completely wrong. White cowboy type hats, wrong. They were black, they were wide and floppy, and they folded up over the head if required. Yellow neckties, wrong. Never wore them. Insignia, such as sergeant stripes and officers' shoulder boards worn on a blue shirt, wrong. The shirt was grey, and in fact it was an undergarment. It was not worn as an outer garment. It was always worn under a tunic or a shell jacket or whatever, and all insignia was worn on the tunic. Suspenders, holding up the pants, wrong. Suspenders were never worn. That's actually what they had belts for. Yeah. Everyone in full uniform all the time, wrong, at least out in the West. Except on formal occasions, reviews and inspections, many men wore mufti, as it's called, which is a mixture of uniform and non-uniform clothing. Sometimes not even in uniform at all. And if you look closely at photographs from, well, say, General Custer's expedition to the Black Hills in 1874, you'll have a job to find anyone in full uniform. Even the officers were attired quite often in buckskin jackets and civilian hats. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn, half a dozen of the officers wore buckskin, and one had a straw hat. Red and white swallow-tailed company flags, with crossed sabres and a regimental number and company letter on them. Wrong again. Until quite late in the Wild West period, the company flags, called guidons, were a swallowtail version of the Union flag, the stars and stripes, with the stars in a circular pattern, no numbers or letters on them. And Western forts did not resemble European castles, surrounded by high ramparts with wall walks for sentries and big gates. Many of them were quite open, with no defences whatsoever. The famous Fort Abraham Lincoln in North Dakota, the home of the 7th Cavalry, for example, extended over a huge area with more than 70 buildings, including a row of normal houses such as one would have found in any town, a whole street of them for the officers. It didn't have any defensive walls. It was really just a small town, you might say, and that's exactly what it looked like. Yet it was one of the most important military bases in the West. So perhaps you can see why movie inaccuracies can have unfortunate results, since the entire image of the United States cavalry is completely wrong. It never existed. It's pure fiction, about as accurate as depicting the Normandy landings in 1944, with everyone in scarlet coats, powdered wigs, and carrying muzzle-loading flintlock muskets. Had Hollywood cavalry ridden up to a military post in the Old West, they probably wouldn't even have been let in, because nobody would have recognized them as United States soldiers. They might have wondered what country they'd come from, but certainly not from the United States. Of course, you may still say, well, so what? Who cares? It's just a movie. Who gives a rat's ass if U.S. cavalrymen wore suspenders or not? Or if Vikings had horned helmets? But I do feel that movie companies, artists illustrating historical publications, and especially places like museums and other educational facilities where one would expect correctness, where proper education is the goal, should try to present as accurate as possible a view of history, which they often don't. But to begin with, let's look at the things Vikings got right, which they did. No horned helmets. No. The correct Viking helmet would have been something like that one. No horns. Now that was nice to see, since the horned helmet was a total myth that came about in 19th century Germany, following the success of Richard Wagner's operatic works, very loosely based, and I do mean loosely based, as in he changed pretty much everything, on the Volsunga saga, those operas being known collectively as Der Ring des Nibelungen, the Ring of the Nibelungs, Das Rheingold, Die Walküre Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung, with costume designers coming up with horns on the helmets of male characters and wings on those of the females, possibly because the main female character was a Valkyrie, and Valkyries were able to fly, so wings probably seemed like a good idea at the time. It wasn't. Anyway, if that inaccuracy had been confined to the operatic stage, well, no harm done, I suppose. But it spread out of the theatre and into popular imagination, thanks to the illustrators of magazines and books of the time, who started drawing horns and wings on every helmet connected in any way whatsoever with the Old Norse, or even any of the Germanic peoples. That concept grew to the point that the horned helmet became synonymous with the Vikings. That's all you needed to show that a character was supposed to be a Viking. Horned helmet, Viking. Even museums keep reinforcing that inaccuracy. And an otherwise brilliant Viking centre here in Dublin, telling the story of Difflin, as it was known to the Norse, with recreated streets and buildings, people in costume and so forth, drops the ball, as far as I'm concerned, with a gift shop that has little horned helmet figures on key rings, plastic horned helmets for kids, and the like. The greatest inaccuracy about the Vikings, and there it is, repeated once again, and this in a supposedly accurate historical educational centre. You see once again why I think movie and TV inaccuracy can cause problems? So, at least the TV show buried that particular inaccuracy. Or at least so I thought. Sadly, I can't give Vikings 100% on that one, because just having watched one episode in the final season, season 6, while I was writing this actually, a character appeared wearing, oh yes, wearing the dreaded horned helmet. And there were nails stuck in the horns, giving the helmet the appearance of a deciduous tree in winter, or a bent cactus, whichever you prefer. So, I'm afraid I have to award the show an accuracy score of 99.9% on that. Only one horned helmet in the whole show, yes, good, but sadly not perfect. Oh well. Things like the longships are very well reproduced. They are excellent reconstructions of Norse ships of that type, as were the various weapons used, swords, axes, and so forth. Viking swords, for example, were very distinctive, with their often multi-load pommels, their very small crossguards, and so on, and those are well shown. Many of the buildings, too, are faithful copies of genuine buildings. And later in the series, when Kattegat has grown into a large fortified walled town, the set resembles very closely an artist's reconstruction of Birke in the Viking Age. Like the fictional Kattegat, a town that lay on the water's edge with a wooden palisade and towers surrounding it on the landward side. The reconstruction based on archaeological excavations and other sources. So they got that pretty much right. As indeed did that other Viking Age TV show, The Last Kingdom, where the reconstruction of towns like Winchester was superb in their depiction of the muddy and rubbish-filled streets of that era. As to the name, Kattegat, there was, and still is, somewhere called Kattegat. It is real enough, but it isn't a town. It isn't even on land, nor is it actually in Norway. It's an area of sea that lies between Denmark and Sweden, the Baltic, draining into it through the Danish Straits. The northern end of that sea, which does actually extend up to Norway, is, however, known as the Skagerrak. But, having mentioned ships, let us start there when it comes to what they got wrong. Now, the ships themselves are very well done, as I've said, but one inaccuracy, common to just about every Viking movie as it happens, are the dragon or sea serpent heads on the prow. Nearly every ship seems to have one, whereas only warships would have carried them, and even then only when they were going to war or raiding, not when they were just lying in harbour. Those heads were detachable, and they were removed if approaching friendly harbours, so as not to frighten the landvatir, the spirits of the land, and to show that the vessel had no hostile intent. And of course, cargo and trading ships wouldn't have had them in the first place. They had no need of them. It wouldn't have helped a merchant's chances of a good deal if he arrived in a ship clearly showing a warlike intention. In Iceland, it was actually illegal for any ship to approach with the dragon heads fitted. So all those ships tied up in Kattegat with dragon heads on them and shields hung along the side is not correct. They would have looked like that when they were going on a raid, but not lying in harbour or being used for trading on occasions when they might have been used for that as well. Another ship error is the time and effort required to actually build one, with Floki seemingly possessed of magic powers that put Thor to shame. The incredible speed with which Floki, with no one to help him, could produce a ship was truly awesome. King Olaf Tryggvason's famous ship, the Long Serpent, took an entire winter to build, with a large team working on it, comprising plank cutters, tree fellers, general labourers, and stemsmiths, under the supervision of a master shipbuilder. And all that lot took months to build the ship, whereas Floki, all by himself, can go off and before you know it, there's a ship, or even several ships. It's sort of, I need a ship, Floki. No problem, Ragnar. I'll have it for you next week. Yeah, well, actually, he'd have it sometime maybe the following year, or maybe even the year after that. Yes, I know, the Long Serpent was huge, over 100 feet in length, but if you consider how long it took for so many men to build it, even reduce the size by 2/3, and it would become an impossible task for just one man on his own. The time Floki takes to produce ships, in actuality, he wouldn't even have been able to cut and shape all the wood he'd require in that time. Plus the fact that the sail required a lot of women doing a lot of weaving. And he doesn't have a lot of women. He has just one. So where did he get the sails from? I find his ability to produce ships rather jarring. It's like, just add water, instant ship. How does Floki do it? Well, he just does. Like so much in science fiction. How can they do that? That's impossible. Well, they just can. They'll have figured out how to do that by the 23rd century. No, they won't actually. Now, helmets. There's an area filled with errors. Yes, no horns, that's good. But also no helmets either, with or without horns. Nobody has a helmet, save for the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks, and now in the final season, the Rus, all of whom have them, every single one of them. Now, while many Vikings might not have worn a helmet, some would have had a leather cap or nothing at all on their head. Anyone of any importance, people like Ragnar, Rollo, Lagatha, Harald Finehair and the like, would have been equipped with helmets and the finest of armour, a chainmail coat, for example. But nobody, even the Jarls and the prominent nobles, has a helmet right through the entire series, apart from Ivar on one occasion, which is very strange, and totally wrong historically. Wealthy men and important nobles would most definitely have equipped themselves with the finest of helmets and armour, and even some ordinary men, farmers or fishermen, going off on a raid, for example, men who weren't warriors as such, would have acquired things like that on previous raids. And the household troops of the kings and jarls, their bodyguards, the housecarls, who were professional warriors, would have been fully armoured. As to body armour, well, armour was also sadly lacking. Lots of leather, padded jackets, and just plain normal tunics, but no proper armour. Chainmail coats called burnies would have been worn by many of the warriors, especially those who went raiding on a regular basis, and certainly by the jarls, their retainers, and the housecarls. The likes of Ragnar and Bjorn Ironside would have been armoured with mail coats. There's actually a burnie hanging up just there. They would reach either down past the hip or knee length. As with helmets, many ordinary men might not have had them. They would be quite expensive, unless they'd acquired them on a raid or after a previous battle. But any man who raided or fought on a regular basis would have had them, and the bodyguards of the nobles would have been fully equipped. Now, the shield maidens who guard Lagertha are a good example, all carrying the identical shield with her emblem on it. And they are what would have been household troops, housecarls, totally professional warriors whose duty it was to protect their master, or in this case, mistress. They should all be clad in chainmail, or at least heavy leather armour, and all of them should be wearing helmets, as indeed should Lagertha herself. But instead of that, we see entire armies going into battle with no more protection than they might have worn when ploughing a field or going fishing. A great warrior like Lagertha would never have gone into battle without a helmet and proper armour. Crossbows. Ooh, now there's another considerable inaccuracy. Swords and axes they got right, bows, no. Well, the crossbow had been used in China from early times. It didn't come into military use in Europe until the 10th century. The first mention of it being used as a military weapon dates from 947 AD in Francia, long after the events in Vikings. So ranks of crossbowmen showering bolts all over the place is incorrect. Longbows and smaller hunting bows, yes. Crossbows, no. Also, while on the subject of bows, the firing of arrows directly at a shield wall, as we see frequently during the show, would not have been done. That would achieve absolutely nothing more than harmlessly hitting shields. That was one of the reasons they formed a shield wall in the first place, to stop things hitting them. Things like arrows, for example. Arrows would have been fired up into the air so that they would drop down onto the enemy, thus either getting in behind the protection of the shield wall or forcing the enemy to lift their shields up over their heads, thus exposing themselves to another flight of arrows, this time fired straight at them. Two groups of archers coordinating their fire in that manner could get results. One group fire high, shields go up, the other group fire low. But just shooting at shields simply wasted arrows, and the enemy might actually just pull them out and fire them back at you. Costumes. First and foremost in the costume arrows must be the leather, which is more reminiscent of a modern biker gang than anything in the 8th and 9th centuries. It's far too pretty, if you like. Boiled leather of that era, which is what would have been worn by warriors, was heavier and not as figure-hugging. The women are not really dressed in a distinctive Scandinavian manner. They are simply vaguely medieval, and they could be from pretty much any country in Europe at that time, from Ireland to Byzantium. There's really nothing about them that says Norse. For example, perhaps the most common form of dress for a Norse woman, at least if she wasn't out in a field or mucking out the barn, her good clothes if you like, was a long underdress that reached down to the ankles, with a shorter overdress, reaching down to somewhere between the knee and the ankle, held up by two shoulder straps and secured with large, round or oval brooches, often very highly decorated. And that form of dress was typical of the Scandinavian countries. The beautiful oval or trefoil brooches used to secure the shoulder straps are common grave items across Scandinavia. It was synonymous with Norse women, yet it didn't make an appearance in the television show throughout the entire series. Nor did most of the clothing, actually, male or female, make any real use of traditional Scandinavian ornamentation or designs or jewellery. It was all, as I've said, vaguely medieval European. Reenactment groups and various Viking festivals held across Scandinavia feature this type of dress for women as a regular thing, and dress the men correctly as well. But why not use groups like that for your extras? And then you get accuracy at minimal cost, since there will be no need to make costumes other than for the principal actors, and the reenactors know what they're doing. Reenactors would already be fully armoured and properly armed with correct weapons as well, and the knowledge of how to use them, which would save a great deal of having to train extras or show them what to do, or indeed obtain weapons. The seer. Oh dear, the seer. Though played very well by John Kavanagh, I must say, who I actually had the pleasure of working with in Dublin's Abbey Theatre back in the 1970s, when he played the young Covey in Sean O'Casey's The Plough and the Stars, and also the Saint in John Millington Synge's The Well of the Saints. The seer is a grotesque figure that bears no relation to anything from Norse history or indeed mythology. This blind and desiccated, dried prune-looking creature, resembling an animated Egyptian mummy, is really quite baffling to me, since there seems no point to him. For one thing, although loss of sight was regarded in many lands as giving one an improvement of the other senses, which indeed it actually does, there is nothing in Norse religious practice that we know of that indicates that a seer was anything other than a normal person, not something that looks like they dug him up from a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Being blind, and it was not a requirement. And secondly, and very importantly, he's a man. Ah, yes. See, that would seem to make the great reverence in which he is held, the respect which everyone has for him, rather unlikely, quite apart from his bizarre appearance, which would have given young children nightmares. Seder, the shamanic magic of Scandinavia, was a woman's job, and the women who practiced it, the Volva singular and the Volva plural, were indeed greatly respected and feared also, since they could use their magic to bring good fortune and health, assist with crops or childbirth and so on, but they could also use it to kill off your cattle or make your crops fail if you angered them. A Volva visiting even the most important Jarl would be given the seat of honour in the hall, and special dishes prepared for her. But a man doing the same thing, that was quite another matter. There were some male practitioners of Seder, right enough, though not very many, because it was seen as unmanly to voluntarily accept the work of women, perhaps even to dress in women's clothes to do it. And men could be called ergi, meaning one who was effeminate, unmanly, not a real man, not one to be trusted to act in a proper manly way. So, given that attitude, the position of the seer in Kattegat, so honoured and respected by everyone, it seems highly unlikely. Some people at least would have shunned him or even abused him. A woman in that role would have been much better from a historical point of view. And, well, if they felt they had to have an Egyptian mummy look-alike for some reason best known to themselves, well, they could have had a blind, prune-faced woman. Now, the shield maidens. Ah, yes, regiments of them. Lagertha's bodyguards, all carrying the same shield, as well as dozens of others, banging drums and marching off to battle with banners flapping in the breeze. And they are seen in all the battles in the show, on both sides, regardless of who they are. Everybody has women lined up in every shield wall. Very impressive, very romantic, very thrilling, and very wrong. Not that there were no shield maidens, there were. And recently a facial reconstruction was done on the body of a woman found buried with military weapons, and the possible battle injury on her head, a woman now officially recognized as a probable warrior. But shield maidens were not like the way they are depicted in the TV show. A regiment of highly trained soldiers, somewhat akin to the leather-clad Dora of the Black Panther movie in Lagertha's case, and a regular part of the normal makeup of everybody else's army. The Skaldmir, or shield maidens, are actually seldom ever mentioned in the sagas by that term, though its use today might make you think it's on every page. But there are frequent mentions of women taking up arms. Now, yes, there were some female warriors, trained specifically to fight rather than just picking up a weapon if needs be, as evidenced by the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, or Saxo the Learned, writing in his Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes, circa 1200. And he states that there were once women in Denmark who dressed themselves to look like men, and spent almost every minute cultivating soldier skills. They courted military expertise so earnestly that anyone would have guessed that they had unsexed themselves. Those especially who had forceful personalities, who were tall and elegant, tended to embark on this way of life. They put toughness before allure, aimed at conflicts instead of kisses, and desired not the couch but the kill, and those they could have appeased with looks, they attacked with lances. They may be seen as very much the shield maidens of the television show, but they were not the norm. Had they been, Saxo wouldn't have mentioned them as he did. He'd have had no need to, just as he didn't mention that men used to train and fight after all. Everybody would have known that. And certainly they would not have been found in large numbers in the forces of every jarl or king as shown in the TV series. A few here or there perhaps, but not regiments of them in every battle on both sides. Now, yes, women were frequently involved in fighting. There are many references to that in the sagas, as were women in the Gallic and Germanic lands, as well as Celtic Ireland, but usually in time of need, rather than specifically training for it, picking up weapons and joining the fight to assist the men, for example, as Gudrun does in the Volsung saga, donning mail and picking up a sword to help her brothers Hogni and Gunnar in battle, or like Skadi, when her father is killed and she dons her armor, takes her weapons, and goes looking for vengeance, showing that the concept of female warriors was accepted, and that since these women clearly knew how to use weapons, since, well, they'd have been killed very quickly if they didn't, one must assume women also had some training in their use. We know as a historical fact that there were female warriors in the 10th century in the army of the Kievan Rus, those Rus who had settled in what is now Russia. And Saxo also mentions a battle in which a considerable number of women took part, even naming some of them. So it's not the existence of the shield maidens that's in question, but rather the way they are shown in the series. Too many, too often, in every battle on both sides. The excellent videos made by the Ribe Viking Center in Denmark show a far more accurate idea of a battle, with the men lined up in a shield wall and women backing them up, standing behind them with spears held out between the men over their shoulders and advancing with them, which would have been a very effective thing and something women could have done very well. Even those who had no training with weapons could jab away with a spear from behind a shield wall, as could older men or those men who had suffered injuries that prevented them from being in the front line, as well as, of course, as men who had no great fighting skills for that matter. And not every Norseman was a ferocious warrior. Simply being born in Norway, Denmark, or Sweden did not automatically give someone amazing combat ability. One had to train for that. And I'm quite sure there were Norsemen who were completely useless when it came to fighting. Of course, the timeline of genuine historical events is greatly telescoped. Things occurring in the show within a few years or even a few months that actually took place over decades. For example, Ragnar raids the monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, or Lindisfarne as it is today, in 793 AD, and he's still hale and hearty enough to raid Paris in 845 AD, 52 years later. I rather doubt he'd have been climbing up ladders by that time. At another point in the story, Alfred is a boy, but in actual fact, he was already King of Wessex at that time. So while many of the major events are genuine historical events, the Lindisfarne and Paris raids, and Rollo granted lands and titles by the Frankish king, for example, the timeline is altered considerably to make them all happen in the space of the various characters' lifetime. As to Rollo, Rollo was not Ragnar's brother. In fact, he wasn't even born in 793 when Ragnar supposedly goes raiding in England. And unlike Ragnar, he is actually a genuine historical figure, while Ragnar was a composite character in the sagas inspired by several genuine Viking leaders over a considerable period. Rollo, or Hrolfr as his name actually was, did indeed receive a grant of land from the Frankish king Charles the Simple, but many years after Ragnar was supposed to have lived, in 911 AD in fact, being granted the city of Rouen and its surroundings in return for converting to Christianity and defending Francia from other Vikings, that land known as the land of the Normanni, or the Northmen, later to become Normandy. He never actually used the title Duke of Normandy, by the way, though he is often called the first Duke, and in fact that title wasn't used until his great-grandson, Richard II, adopted it. Now, I'm sorry to spoil much of the romantic aspect of the show. You might want to sit down before I say this, but Ragnar was never married to Lagertha. No. Of course, since he never actually existed, I suppose he couldn't really be married to anyone. But anyway, in the sagas, his first wife was Thora, and then he married Oswald, who wasn't shot in the back with an arrow by Lagertha. No, she lived quite happily, and she was herself quite a warrior. donning chainmail and leading an army on one occasion to attack Sweden. Another example of the acceptance of the concept of warrior women. Ragnar does meet Lagertha in the sagas, right enough, though only briefly, having no other connection with her. Now, despite Ragnar being a non-existent fictional character, his sons were real enough, 4 of them at least. Ivar in Beinlausi, or Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, and Ubba. They are genuine historical characters. The other 2 are less likely. We don't really know about them. Now, that does raise the question, of course, of how a man who didn't exist could produce children, something that is biologically, well, a bit difficult to put mildly. The most likely theory is that those men were genuine historical brothers, and they probably had a father named Ragnar, thus giving them the surname, the Ragnarsson, even though he was a Ragnar, not the Ragnar. And they probably simply cashed in on a legend of their own time, claiming a relationship with the great hero that couldn't possibly have existed. But, of course, it sounded good. As we might say today, it made them really booyah! You didn't argue with a son of Ragnar Lothbrok. Oh, no. And Ragnar's name was actually Ragnar Sigurdsson. Lothbrok was a nickname, and it meant hairy or shaggy breeches, from a special pair of pants he wore on one occasion. People do often think that that was his name, but like many Vikings, he was known by a nickname rather than his real name. Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, or Harald Finehair would be other examples of that. Those were not their actual surnames. As to the religious aspects of the show, well, it's somewhat hard to say if a thing is right or wrong at times, since our knowledge of Norse religious practices is just about nil. We know quite a bit about what they did, but not how they did it. For example, we know that a blot or sacrifice was performed, and this could be an animal or human sacrifice or simply offerings of food and meat, but we don't know what was said. We don't know the actual wording of incantations or prayers that were used. We know that songs were sung, but not what the words were, only that they were sung. And even when some details are given, we can't actually use them, as in the case of the 18 spell songs of Odin, when we are told by Odin himself what each song does, and that he knows how to sing them, which is fine for him, but we don't, because he doesn't tell us the words. Now, those things were never written down by the Norse themselves, nor did those who did write them down in the sagas and poems later on tell us that. Men like Snorri Sturluson in Iceland or Saxo Grammaticus in Denmark during the 13th century. Even if the actual incantations, I should say, and so on, had been handed down by word of mouth, which is how all the sagas and stories did come down from Old Norse times, it's rather doubtful that someone like Snorri would have written them down for public consumption. The church would have, well, they would have seen things like that as instructions to summon Satan or his minions, and they would have taken a very dim view of anyone making them available, and would most certainly have made their displeasure felt, probably in a rather unpleasant and painful manner. So it's hard to reconstruct any ceremony from those times as regards what was actually done. We don't have the script, you could say, and it has to be based on what we know as shamanic rituals from other cultures that have a similar, possibly, style, and that we do know more information about. The shamans of the nearby Slavic regions, or those of the North Germanic tribes, would probably have been not unlike the Old Norse. So while I can say the various religious scenes do follow some shamanic practices, the use of blood, the little figures of the gods, the servant sacrificed to accompany her master in death, something we know the Norse actually did, and so forth, it's not really possible generally to say that they're right or they're wrong in an Old Norse context, because we simply don't know exactly how they did them. I do wonder if the showrunners have ever actually looked at a map of Scandinavia, since in the final season of the show, the Rus begin raids against Norway, sending horsemen to attack villages and slaughter the inhabitants, planting their flag to let the Vikings know they are coming. Yes, but to go from Kiev to Norway on horseback would require either going north through Finland and Sweden, which would mean that chances of ever reaching Norway would be nil, since the Finns and the Swedes would almost certainly, rather object to that somewhat strongly, I should think. Or you have to go south along the Baltic coast and through Denmark, again, having to get past the Danes and also cross the sea to reach Norway. You cannot get to Norway from Kiev directly, other than by going by ship across the Baltic. So how did those mounted warriors manage to just ride across the border and attack villages? Well, I suppose getting back to the science fiction thing, they just did. So that concludes this look at Vikings. Overall, an entertaining show with some outstanding performances. Eva, for example, and Floki, who is absolutely brilliant. But I really do wish they had paid more attention to detail. One could say, and I'm sure they will, does it really matter that nobody has chainmail or a helmet? Do most of those watching the show actually know what they should be wearing, or care for that matter? No, probably not on both counts. But I personally feel that historical accuracy should be part of dramatic productions as much as possible, since there is an educational aspect as well as an entertainment one, as I've said. Look at the extent of the horned helmet inaccuracy. There's a perfect example of what can result from incorrect historical representation. That's why I find the Thor movies really hard to watch. Everything is so completely wrong. They really only get the names right. And actually, even some of those are wrong. But I've met people who think that they give an actual picture of lost beliefs, when in fact they are roughly on a level, well, with learning about life in the United States by watching Peter Griffin or Homer Simpson. I've mentioned The Last Kingdom, which is pretty good, and a very well made series is the Norwegian comedy show Norseman, as well as the movie The Last King, also made in Norway. They're all well worth watching. So, if you've enjoyed this video, you might like to subscribe to my channel to get news of further videos, and a share will be very much appreciated, I assure you. So, until next time, I shall say farewell. Goodbye for now.